The morning air on Kepler-7 carried the scent of ammonia flowers as students from across the galaxy made their way to the Galactic Academy. The massive crystalline structure rose from the planet's surface like a geometric mountain, its walls shifting colors as different species adjusted the lighting to suit their vision. Inside classroom 847C, students settled into their bioadaptive seats as Professor Velthun prepared for another lecture on interspecies relations. Jake Collins sat in his usual spot near the back corner, adjusting his seat's atmosphere mixture to maintain Earth-normal oxygen levels. The human student had grown accustomed to being one of only 3 humans at the academy, but today felt different. His classmates seemed more animated than usual, whispering in their native languages and casting glances in his direction. Professor Velthun entered the room with her characteristic flowing movement, her elongated limbs carrying her tall frame with an otherworldly grace. The Altarian instructor's skin shifted from deep purple to neutral gray, indicating she was ready to begin. Her 4 eyes surveyed the classroom before she spoke in the universal translation language that all students understood. Today we will examine a recent development in galactic politics, she announced, her voice carrying the melodic quality typical of her species. The Galactic Council has implemented what they call the Human Prohibition Protocol. Jake's stomach dropped. He had hoped this topic would not come up in class, but he knew it was inevitable. The protocol had been the talk of every newsfeed for months. Zixtal, a crystalline Vorthan student, immediately raised one of her sharp appendages. Her body chimed softly as she spoke, the sound created by vibrations within her mineral structure. Professor, is this the regulation that prevents humans from military service throughout the galaxy? Correct, Professor Velthun replied. The protocol prohibits human participation in any armed conflicts, peacekeeping missions, or military operations involving member species of the Galactic Council. Quinara's tentacles writhed with what Jake recognized as barely contained amusement. The Nephilim student's voice carried a wet, bubbling quality as she spoke. But why would anyone need protection from humans? They are so fragile and weak compared to most species. Several students began to murmur agreement. Brektor, whose scaled Draknari hide could deflect most small arms fire, let out a low, rumbling sound that served as laughter for his species. I have seen humans in the Academy gymnasium, he said, his voice deep and gravelly. They struggle to lift weights that my younglings play with. Jake gripped the edge of his desk but remained silent. He had learned long ago that defending himself only made things worse. Professor Velthun attempted to maintain order. Class, please remember that we are here to study policy, not to make personal judgments about different species. But the damage was done. Zixtal's chiming grew more musical, which indicated excitement. I heard that humans have only one heart, she said. How can they survive serious injury with such limited redundancy? Their bones break easily too, added Nethan, a student from the insectoid klaxon species. Her mandibles clicked rapidly as she spoke. I read that human bones are mostly calcium carbonate, like the shells of primitive sea creatures. Quinara's tentacles swayed with amusement. Perhaps the council banned them from military service as an act of mercy. Imagine sending such delicate beings into actual combat situations. Jake felt his face flush red, a human response that did not go unnoticed by his classmates. Several species could detect changes in blood flow and body temperature, making human emotions often visible to alien observers. Brektor noticed Jake's reaction and seemed to find it even more amusing. Look, the human is changing color again. Even their emotional responses are fragile and obvious. Professor Velthun raised one of her long arms. That is enough. We will examine the facts of the protocol, not engage in speculation about human physiology. But the professor's intervention came too late. The mood in the classroom had shifted, and Jake could feel the weight of dozens of alien eyes studying him with a mixture of curiosity and pity. During the break between classes, the situation grew worse. As Jake gathered his materials, Quinara approached his desk with several other students trailing behind her. Jake, she said, her tentacles curling in what he had learned was a gesture of condescension among her species. We have been wondering about something. Jake looked up but did not respond, knowing that anything he said would likely be used against him. If humans are banned from military service, why are you studying tactical analysis and conflict resolution? Surely those subjects are useless for your species now. Zixtal chimed in agreement. It does seem like a waste of resources to train humans in areas they can never use. Maybe he wants to be a military historian, Brektor suggested, his rumbling laughter echoing through the classroom. He can study wars but never participate in them. Jake stood slowly, his movements careful and controlled. He was taller than most of his classmates, but his height seemed insignificant compared to their natural weapons and armor. Quinara's tentacles could crush bone. Zixtal's crystalline body could generate lethal electrical charges, and Brektor's scales could turn aside blades. I am here to learn, Jake said quietly. Same as everyone else. But what is the point? Nethan asked, her compound eyes focusing on him with insectoid precision. Your species is clearly not suited for the military applications we study. The galaxy has recognized this and acted accordingly. Jake felt something dark stir in his chest, but he pushed it down. These students had no idea what they were talking about. They saw human limitations but not human capabilities. They understood the restrictions of the protocol but not the reasons behind it. You think you know why the protocol exists, Jake said, his voice still quiet but carrying a different quality now. Of course we do, Quinara replied. The Council created it to protect humans from situations they cannot handle. Jake looked around the classroom at the faces of his classmates. Some showed open amusement. Others displayed what might have been pity. None showed understanding. You are wrong, Jake said simply. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Professor Velthun, who had been organizing her materials at the front of the room, looked up with interest. Wrong about what? Brektor asked, his tone becoming more aggressive. Jake shouldered his bag and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he turned back to face his classmates. You are wrong about why the protocol exists, he said. And someday, I hope you never have to learn the truth. The classroom fell silent as Jake left, leaving behind a group of confused and slightly irritated alien students who had no idea that their mockery was about to lead them down a path they would never forget. The days following Jake's quiet declaration passed like a slow storm building on the horizon. What had started as casual mockery in Professor Velthun's classroom transformed into something more deliberate and cruel. The alien students seemed to take Jake's words as a personal challenge, and they responded accordingly. Brektor was the worst of them. The large Draknari student had apparently decided that Jake needed to be taught a lesson about speaking up to his betters. During combat simulation class, he made sure to partner with Jake for every exercise, using his superior strength and natural armor to dominate every scenario. When Jake tried to use strategy and speed to compensate, Brektor would simply laugh and overpower him through brute force. This is why your species needs protection, Brektor would say after each victory, his scaled hide gleaming under the simulation room lights. You think too much and feel too little. Quinara took a different approach. She began what she called Jake's protection detail, a cruel game where she and her friends would surround Jake between classes, claiming they needed to keep the fragile human safe from the dangerous academy environment. They would guide him through the corridors like he was made of glass, warning other students to be careful around the delicate earthling. Watch out, Quinara would announce loudly when other students passed by. Human bones break very easily. We must all be very gentle. Her tentacles would hover near Jake's shoulders as if ready to catch him if he stumbled, and her friends would nod solemnly, as if this protection was a serious responsibility. The performance drew attention from across the academy, and soon Jake found himself the center of unwanted sympathy from students who believed he actually needed such care. Zixtal contributed her own form of torment through academic humiliation. During tactical analysis class, she would question every answer Jake gave, claiming that human thinking was too linear and primitive for complex military problems. When Professor Kethron assigned group projects, she made sure Jake was always given the simplest tasks, explaining to their teammates that humans could not handle complicated assignments. Jake can organize our notes, she would chime, her crystalline body flashing with what Jake had learned was smug satisfaction. Simple filing work is more suitable for human capabilities. The worst part was that many of their professors seemed to find the situation amusing rather than concerning. Professor Velthun maintained professional neutrality, but Jake caught her hiding smiles when his classmates made particularly creative jokes about human limitations. Professor Kethrun openly laughed when Brektor demonstrated how easily he could pin Jake during combat exercises. Perhaps Mr. Collins should consider transferring to the Agricultural Studies program, Professor Kethrun suggested, after one particularly humiliating training session. Growing food is important work that requires no physical confrontation. Jake endured it all in silence, but something was changing inside him. Each joke, each protective gesture, each casual dismissal of human capabilities added weight to a growing anger that he kept carefully controlled. His classmates saw his quiet responses as proof of human weakness, but Jake knew better. He was not being weak, he was being careful. The breaking point came during a theoretical combat scenario in advanced tactical theory. Professor Mordeth, a veteran military instructor from the warlike hegemon species, had designed a complex multi-species conflict simulation. Students were divided into teams representing different galactic factions, and each team had to develop strategies for defeating their opponents. Jake found himself assigned to the smallest team, partnered only with 2 exchange students from minor species that most of the class barely acknowledged. Their opponents included Brektor, Quinara, and Zixtal, along with several other students from militarily powerful species. The scenario involved defending a civilian population center against a superior attacking force. Jake's team was assigned the defensive role, while their classmates got to play the attackers. Professor Mordeth made it clear that he expected the exercise to be over quickly. Defenders have inferior numbers and limited resources, he announced, his scarred face showing amusement. This should demonstrate the importance of choosing strong allies. Jake studied the scenario parameters while his teammates looked discouraged. The attacking force had every advantage except one. They had to capture the civilian center intact. This meant they could not simply destroy everything from orbit. As the simulation began, Jake's classmates approached with the casual confidence of predators cornering prey. Brektor led a direct assault on the main defensive positions, while Quinara coordinated flanking maneuvers. Zixtal managed electronic warfare from a mobile command position. For the first phase of the battle, everything went as expected. Jake's small team was pushed back steadily, losing ground and resources. Professor Mordeth nodded approvingly as the attacking students demonstrated textbook combined arms tactics, but Jake was not trying to win the first phase. He was studying his opponents, learning their patterns and preferences. When Brektor attacked, he always chose the most direct route. When Quinara flanked, she favored approaches that kept her tentacles protected. When Zixtal managed electronics, she positioned herself where she could retreat quickly if threatened. In the second phase, Jake began his real strategy. Instead of defending fixed positions, he started targeting the attacking force's supply lines and communication networks. His small team split up and began hit-and-run attacks on vulnerable support elements while avoiding direct confrontation with stronger opponents. "What is he doing?" Quinara asked, frustration creeping into her voice as her carefully planned flanking maneuvers found empty defensive positions. Jake was doing something that his classmates had not expected. He was making the battle personal. Instead of treating it like a chess game with military units, he was treating it like a fight for the lives of the civilians his team was supposed to protect. Every lost building was not just a tactical setback, but a failure to protect innocent people. The change in Jake's approach was subtle but significant. His movements became more aggressive, his tactics more creative, and his determination more obvious. When Brektor cornered one of Jake's teammates, Jake did not retreat or try to negotiate. He launched a coordinated attack on 3 different targets simultaneously, forcing Brektor to choose between finishing his current fight or saving his own support elements. Professor Mordeth leaned forward with interest as the simulation took an unexpected turn. The human student was not fighting like someone trying to win a game. He was fighting like someone trying to save lives. By the end of the exercise, Jake's team had not won in any traditional sense. They still held less territory and had fewer resources than when they started. But they had saved more civilians than anyone expected, and they had made the attacking force pay a price for every meter of ground. More importantly, Jake had demonstrated something that made his classmates uncomfortable. When the stakes became personal, when innocent lives were at risk, the quiet human student had transformed into something different. Not stronger or faster or tougher, but more determined and more willing to accept losses in pursuit of his goals. After the simulation ended, the classroom was unusually quiet. Professor Mordeth studied the results with obvious surprise, while Jake's classmates avoided making eye contact with him. Finally, Brektor broke the silence. "You fought differently than expected," he said, his usual arrogance replaced by something that might have been uncertainty. Jake gathered his materials and stood to leave. He paused at the door and looked back at his classmates, the same group that had spent weeks mocking his species and treating him like a fragile child. "I told you that you were wrong about the protocol," he said quietly. "If you really want to understand why it exists, maybe you should ask Professor Velthun to request the classified recordings." Quinara's tentacles curled with curiosity. "What recordings?" "The ones that convinced the Galactic Council to create the ban in the first place," Jake replied. "The ones that show what humans are actually capable of when we stop holding back." He left the classroom behind him, knowing that his words had planted a seed of curiosity that would soon grow into something his classmates were not prepared to handle. Professor Velthun stood before the large display screen in the Academy's main auditorium, her 4 eyes scanning the gathered students with an expression that Jake had never seen before. The usual calm confidence was replaced by something that looked almost like nervousness. Behind her, the screen remained dark, waiting to show whatever classified material the Galactic Council had agreed to release for educational purposes. The request had been approved faster than anyone expected. Within 3 days of Jake's challenge, official authorization had arrived from the highest levels of galactic government. Professor Velthun had seemed surprised by the quick response, and Jake suspected that someone in the council wanted these recordings to be seen. Jake sat in his usual spot while his classmates filled the auditorium around him. The excitement in the room was obvious. Brektor had spent the morning boasting about how the recordings would finally prove human weakness to everyone. Quinara had gathered a group of friends to witness what she called the great revelation of human inadequacy. Even Zixtal, usually more reserved than her classmates, chimed with anticipation. "Before we begin," Professor Velthun said, her melodic voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "I must warn you that these recordings contain graphic content. The Galactic Council has classified them as disturbing material, suitable only for advanced military studies." Several students laughed at this warning. The idea that anything involving humans could be truly disturbing struck them as ridiculous. "I would also like to remind you," the professor continued, "that these recordings document real events involving real individuals. The beings you will see fought and died in actual combat situations. Please maintain appropriate respect." Brektor rumbled with amusement. "Professor, with respect, how disturbing can footage of human military action actually be? We have all seen humans in our combat simulations." Professor Velthun's skin shifted to a darker purple, indicating what Jake recognized as concern among her species. "Mr. Brektor, I believe you will find that there is a significant difference between academic exercises and actual warfare." She turned to the control panel and began entering the access codes that would unlock the classified material. The first recording documents an engagement on the colony world of Sievo Prime during the Outer Rim conflicts. A small human outpost came under attack by Kethmar raiders. Jake felt his stomach tighten. He knew about the Kethmar from his studies. They were a species bred for warfare, standing nearly 3 meters tall with natural armor plating and enhanced muscle density. Their culture valued only strength and conquest, and they were known for taking no prisoners. The screen flickered to life, showing aerial footage of a small military compound surrounded by rocky terrain. The image quality was crystal clear, recorded by military surveillance drones that captured every detail of the coming battle. The human outpost contained 12 soldiers, Professor Velthun narrated as the recording began. They were attacked by approximately 200 Kethmar warriors. Standard military doctrine would recommend immediate evacuation when facing such overwhelming odds. The first Kethmar appeared on the screen, moving through the rocks around the outpost like shadows. Jake could hear his classmates whispering excitedly, expecting to see humans running away or surrendering quickly. Instead, they watched Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez calmly organizing her soldiers for defense. Her voice came through the audio clearly as she assigned positions and checked ammunition supplies. There was no panic in her tone, no indication that she considered retreat or surrender. "Ma'am," one of her soldiers said, "sensors show at least 200 hostiles approaching from multiple directions." "Copy that, Sergeant," Amy replied. "All units maintain positions. We hold this line." Quinara's tentacles stopped swaying as she processed what she was hearing. 200 against 12, and they are choosing to fight? The attack began with a coordinated assault from 3 directions. The Kethmar moved with deadly precision, their natural armor allowing them to advance even under direct fire from human weapons. Jake watched his classmates lean forward in their seats, expecting to see the humans overwhelmed within minutes. What they saw instead was something none of them had anticipated. The human soldiers did not break when the odds became impossible. They did not retreat when their positions were overrun. They adapted, regrouped, and continued fighting with a determination that seemed to defy logic. Sergeant Ben Murphy took position on the compound's main tower, providing covering fire as his teammates moved between defensive positions. When Kethmar, warriors broke through the perimeter, he did not abandon his post. Instead, he continued fighting even as enemy forces climbed the tower toward him. "Rodriguez's tower position is compromised," Ben reported calmly, even as massive Kethmar warriors smashed through the structure below him. "Can you hold?" Amy asked from her position near the communications center. "Negative, ma'am. But I can buy you time." Jake watched his classmates' faces as they began to understand what they were seeing. These humans were not retreating or surrendering despite impossible odds. They were choosing to fight and die rather than give up their positions. The most shocking moment came when Ben Murphy found himself surrounded on the collapsing tower. 3 Kethmar warriors had reached his position, and his ammunition was nearly depleted. Any reasonable soldier would have surrendered at that point, hoping for mercy or prisoner exchange. Instead, Ben activated a thermal grenade. The explosion lit up the screen as the tower collapsed, taking Ben and his attackers with it. His final transmission came through clearly over the audio. "Tell my kids I kept my promise." The auditorium fell completely silent. Jake could see Zixtal's crystalline structure dimming, a sign of shock among her species. Quinara's tentacles had gone completely still, and even Brektor's usual confident posture had changed. But the recording was not finished. Amy Rodriguez continued coordinating the defense with 11 soldiers, then 10, then 8. Each loss seemed to make the remaining humans fight harder rather than weaker. When Corporal Lisa Hayes took shrapnel to her leg, she continued operating the communications equipment from a sitting position. When Private Dan Mitchell lost his left arm to Kethmar claws, he switched his rifle to his right hand and kept shooting. "This cannot be normal behavior," Nathan whispered, her mandibles clicking rapidly with distress. The recording showed the final phase of the battle, where 4 surviving humans held the communications center against dozens of Kethmar warriors. Amy Rodriguez had been wounded twice but continued giving orders and coordinating fire. Her soldiers followed those orders without question, even when following them meant certain death. When rescue forces finally arrived, they found Amy Rodriguez still alive, still holding her position, and still trying to treat the wounds of her fallen soldiers. The Kethmar had retreated after losing nearly half their force to 12 humans who refused to surrender. The screen went dark, and Professor Velthun turned to face her students. The auditorium remained silent for several long moments. "Questions?" she asked quietly. Brektor raised one scaled hand, his usual arrogance completely gone. "Professor, is this recording authentic, unedited?" "Completely authentic," she replied. This footage was submitted as evidence during the Galactic Council hearings on human military capabilities. Zixtal's chiming voice was barely audible. They knew they could not win, but they fought anyway. They did more than fight, Professor Velthun corrected. They fought more effectively as their situation became more desperate. This is not normal behavior among galactic species. Quinara's tentacles curled with what Jake recognized as confusion mixed with fear. But why? What could motivate such actions? Professor Velthun looked directly at Jake before answering. That question led to extensive psychological studies of human soldiers. The results of those studies contributed directly to the human prohibition protocol. Jake stood slowly and gathered his materials. Every eye in the auditorium followed his movement as he walked toward the exit. Just before leaving, he turned back to address his classmates. Sergeant Murphy had 2 children, he said quietly. 7 and 9 years old. He promised them he would come home. But when that became impossible, he kept a different promise. He made sure his sacrifice meant something. The auditorium remained silent as Jake left, but he could feel the weight of dozens of alien minds, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The mockery was over, but Jake knew that what would replace it might be even worse. The academy felt different in the days following the first recording. Students who had previously filled the corridors with loud conversations now moved quietly, stealing glances at Jake as he passed. The casual mockery had stopped completely, replaced by something that made Jake almost miss the earlier hostility. Now his classmates looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and unease that felt far more uncomfortable than their previous dismissal. Professor Velthun had scheduled the second viewing for the following week, but the anticipation was obvious throughout the academy. Jake overheard fragments of whispered conversations as students debated what they had seen. Some tried to dismiss the Sarajevo recording as an unusual case, while others wondered if all humans behave that way in combat situations. Brektor had become noticeably quieter during classes. The large Draknari student no longer dominated combat simulations with casual confidence. During their most recent exercise, he had actually asked Jake for tactical advice, something that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. "Your species approaches warfare differently than expected," Brektor had said, his rumbling voice lacking its usual arrogance. "Do all human soldiers fight like those in the recording?" Jake had simply shrugged and refused to answer, knowing that anything he said would only make his classmates more uncomfortable. When the day of the second viewing arrived, the auditorium was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread throughout the academy about the first recording, and students from other classes had requested permission to attend. Jake noticed several professors in the audience, including some from departments that had nothing to do with military studies. Professor Velthun stood before the assembled crowd with the same nervous expression she had worn during the previous session. Her skin had shifted to a darker purple that indicated serious concern among her species. "The second recording," she began, "documents what became known as the Mars Incident. This event led directly to the implementation of the Human Prohibition Protocol." Jake felt his chest tighten. He had heard stories about Mars from his father, but the official records remained classified. Even humans were not supposed to know the complete details of what had happened there. "The incident began as a routine peacekeeping mission," Professor Velthun continued. "Human forces were deployed to prevent a massacre of Zilani civilians by Korath supremacists on the colony world of New Mars." Nethan's mandibles clicked nervously. The Zilani were known throughout the galaxy as a peaceful species that had never developed military technology. They were farmers and artists, completely defenseless against aggressive neighbors. The human peacekeeping force consisted of 37 soldiers under the command of Captain Lisa Hayes. Their mission was to establish a protected zone around Zilani settlements and negotiate a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The screen flickered to life, showing orbital footage of a planet's surface covered in agricultural settlements. The Zilani buildings were beautiful organic structures that seemed to grow from the Earth itself, designed for beauty rather than defense. Jake could see Korath military vehicles approaching the settlements like predators surrounding prey. The Korath were a militaristic species known for their belief in racial superiority and their practice of enslaving or eliminating beings they considered inferior. The initial phase proceeded according to standard peacekeeping protocols. Professor Felthun narrated as the recording showed human dropships landing near the largest Zilani settlement. Captain Hayes established defensive positions and opened communications with Korath commanders. The first part of the recording looked like textbook peacekeeping work. Captain Lisa Hayes met with Korath leaders under a flag of truce, attempting to negotiate a withdrawal from Zilani territory. Her soldiers maintained professional discipline, establishing checkpoints and protective barriers without showing aggression toward either side. Jake watched his classmates relax slightly as they observed normal military behavior. Perhaps the IREON Sarajevo recording had been an unusual case after all. Then everything changed. The Korath commanders had apparently decided that negotiations were pointless. While Captain Hayes was returning to her command post, Korath forces began systematically executing Zilani civilians in full view of the human peacekeepers. The transformation in the human soldiers was immediate and terrifying. Jake watched his classmates lean forward in shock as disciplined peacekeepers became something else entirely. The change was not gradual or hesitant. One moment the humans were following careful rules of engagement, and the next moment they were advancing on Korath positions with deadly purpose. "Command, this is Hayes." Captain Lisa's voice came through the audio, but her tone had changed completely. "Korath forces are executing civilians. We are moving to weapons free." "Captain, your orders are to maintain defensive positions only," came the reply from Orbital Command. "Negative, Command. We have civilians being murdered in front of us. We are engaging." What followed was unlike anything the alien students had ever seen. The human soldiers moved through Korath positions like a force of nature, their previous restraint replaced by methodical violence. But this was not the desperate last stand they had witnessed in the Sarajevo recording. This was organized, calculated, and absolutely ruthless. Sergeant Paul Johnson led a squad through a Korath command center, eliminating resistance with precision that bordered on artistic. When Korath soldiers tried to surrender, he accepted their surrender and secured them properly. When they continued fighting, he killed them without hesitation or emotion. "They are still following military law," Quinara whispered, her tentacles writhing with confusion. "But they are also completely different soldiers." The most disturbing footage showed Corporal Dan Mitchell coordinating artillery strikes while treating a severe wound to his left arm. He had been injured during the initial assault, but continued calling in fire support for 17 minutes, without mentioning his injury to command. "Mitchell, report your status," Captain Hayes requested over the radio. "All operational, ma'am. Korath armor is neutralized in sectors 7 through 12. Jake could see his injured arm hanging useless at his side, but Dan's voice remained steady and professional as he directed the destruction of enemy forces. The recording showed human soldiers pursuing fleeing Korath forces through 3 city blocks, ensuring that none escaped to threaten civilians elsewhere. They fought with injuries that would have incapacitated most species, showing no sign of pain or hesitation. But the most shocking element was their emotional state. Unlike the desperate determination shown in the Sarajevo recording, these humans fought with cold efficiency. They were not afraid or angry. They were simply doing what needed to be done to protect innocent lives. "This is not normal behavior," Zixtal chimed quietly, her crystalline structure flickering with distress. "They are fighting more effectively because they are emotionally involved, not less effectively." The recording ended with aftermath footage. The Korath threat had been eliminated completely. 847 Zilani civilians had been saved. The human casualties were extensive but not fatal, though the psychological evaluation reports attached to the file painted a different picture. Professor Velthun turned to face the silent auditorium. The Mars incident convinced the Galactic Council that human military involvement posed significant risks to galactic stability. Brektor raised a shaking hand. "Professor, what kind of risks?" The psychological evaluations revealed that human soldiers experience what they call moral injury when they witness atrocities against innocent beings. This injury does not weaken them. It removes their psychological limitations on the use of violence. Jake stood to leave, but Quinara's voice stopped him. "Jake," she said quietly, "are all humans like this when protecting others?" Jake turned to look at his classmates, seeing fear in their eyes for the first time. They were beginning to understand something that terrified them. "When we need to be," he replied, using the same words from weeks earlier. But now those words carried a weight that made the entire auditorium fall silent. As Jake walked toward the exit, he could hear Professor Velthun beginning to explain the psychological studies that had led to the human prohibition protocol. His classmates were about to learn that the ban was not created to protect humans from the dangers of war. It was created to protect everyone else from what humans became when they decided that something was worth fighting for. The final class session felt like a funeral. Students who had once filled the auditorium with excited chatter now sat in uncomfortable silence, waiting for Professor Velthun to explain what they had witnessed. The two recordings had shattered their understanding of human capabilities, and now they needed to learn why the galaxy had responded with fear rather than admiration. Jake took his usual seat in the back, but today he was not alone. Several empty chairs surrounded him like a protective barrier that his classmates had unconsciously created. They still looked at him, but their expressions had changed completely. The mockery and pity were gone, replaced by something that made Jake feel more isolated than their earlier dismissal. Professor Velthun entered the auditorium, carrying a datapad filled with official documents. Her skin remained the dark purple. That indicated serious concern, and Jake noticed that her movements seemed more careful than usual, as if she was approaching something dangerous. "Today we will discuss the creation of the Human Prohibition Protocol," she announced, her melodic voice carrying clearly through the silent auditorium. "The recordings you have seen represent only a small sample of the evidence that convinced the Galactic Council to implement this unprecedented restriction." Rector raised one scaled hand, his usual confidence replaced by obvious uncertainty. "Professor, the humans in those recordings fought bravely to protect others. Why would the Council respond with punishment rather than recognition?" "Professor," Velthun consulted her datapad before answering. "The Council's concern was not with human courage or tactical ability. Their concern was with human psychology and its implications for galactic stability." She activated the main display screen, showing official documents from the Galactic Council archives. The text was written in formal diplomatic language, but the meaning was clear enough for the students to understand. After analyzing 17 separate military engagements involving human forces, Professor Velthun read from the documents, Council psychologists identified behavioral patterns that distinguish human warriors from all other known species. Quinara's tentacles curled nervously. "What kind of patterns?" "First, humans exhibit what researchers termed unlimited escalation capacity. Unlike other species, humans show no biological or psychological mechanisms that prevent them from fighting beyond normal survival thresholds." Jake watched his classmates process this information. They were beginning to understand that the recordings had not shown humans at their limits, but humans just getting started. Second, human soldiers demonstrate what the report calls emotional amplification of combat effectiveness. While most species become less efficient when emotionally distressed, humans become more dangerous when protecting beings they care about. Zixtal's crystalline structure flickered with distress. "The reports mentioned pack bonding behavior. What does this mean?" Professor Velthun turned to a new section of her datapad. Human pack bonding extends beyond their own species. Humans will form protective emotional attachments to any beings they perceive as innocent or vulnerable. This includes species they have never encountered before. She displayed a psychological evaluation report on the main screen. Jake could see excerpts from interviews with human soldiers who had participated in various peacekeeping missions. Dr. Thaisara of the Hegemony Psychology Institute wrote the definitive analysis. Professor Velthun continued. She concluded that humans in any conflict would inevitably begin fighting, not just for their assigned objectives, but for anyone they viewed as needing protection. Nathan's mandibles clicked rapidly. "This explains the behavior we saw in the recordings. They were not just following orders." "Correct. The Mars incident demonstrated that human soldiers will ignore direct orders from their own command structure if they believe innocent lives are at stake. This makes them impossible to control in complex political situations. Jake felt the weight of dozens of alien eyes studying him as Professor Velthun continued reading from the official reports. The documents painted a picture of human nature that even Jake found disturbing when presented in clinical language. The most concerning finding, Professor Velthun said, was the discovery that human combat effectiveness increases proportionally with their emotional investment in protecting others. Council member Thaisara described this as unprecedented among galactic species. She read directly from the official report. Other species have biological limitations that prevent them from fighting beyond certain thresholds. Pain, exhaustion, and psychological stress eventually force all known warriors to retreat or surrender. Humans appear to have no such limitations when they believe they are protecting innocent lives. Brektor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Professor, are you saying that humans become more dangerous when they care about something? Exactly. This creates an impossible situation for military planners. Human forces cannot be relied upon to follow orders that conflict with their protective instincts, but they also cannot be controlled through normal deterrence methods. Professor Velthun displayed another section of the Council records showing debate transcripts from the sessions that created the Prohibition Protocol. Council member Velkathul of the Trade Federation summarized the problem clearly, she read. He stated, "If we allow humans to participate in galactic conflicts, they will inevitably transform limited political disputes into absolute moral crusades." Jake realized that his classmates were no longer looking at him with curiosity or fear. They were looking at him with something closer to horror as they understood the implications of human nature for galactic peace. The final decision came after the Nexus Station incident. Professor Velthun continued. Human peacekeepers were assigned to monitor a labor dispute between mining corporations and worker organizations. When corporate security forces began using excessive violence against striking workers, the human response was immediate and absolute. She displayed footage from the incident, showing human soldiers turning their weapons on the very corporations they had been sent to protect. The transformation from neutral peacekeepers to active participants happened in minutes, triggered by their perception that innocent workers needed protection. The incident lasted 6 hours, Professor Velthun narrated. When it ended, the corporate security forces had been completely eliminated. The workers had been evacuated to safety, and the human peacekeepers had violated every aspect of their original mission parameters. Quinara's voice was barely audible. What happened to the human soldiers? They were recalled to Earth and reassigned to defensive duties only. But the damage to galactic confidence was complete. The Council realized that humans could not be trusted to maintain political neutrality in any situation involving perceived injustice. Jake stood slowly, knowing that this was the moment to share his own connection to these events. His classmates watched nervously as he moved to the front of the auditorium. My father was Colonel Ryan Collins, he said quietly. He commanded the human forces during the Nexus Station incident. The auditorium fell completely silent. Even Professor Velthun looked surprised by this revelation. He told me about that day, Jake continued. He said the hardest part was not the fighting. The hardest part was explaining to his superior officers why he had chosen to protect striking miners instead of following his orders. Jake looked around the auditorium at faces that now showed open fear. His classmates finally understood why the human prohibition protocol existed. My father said that when he saw corporate security forces beating unarmed workers, he stopped being a neutral peacekeeper and became something else. He said that humans cannot watch innocent people suffer without acting, even when acting means breaking every rule they have been given. Brektor's voice was shaking. Jake, are all humans like this? Jake considered the question carefully before answering. The protocol exists because the Galactic Council decided that the answer is yes. They concluded that any human placed in a situation involving innocent victims will eventually choose to protect those victims over following orders or maintaining political stability. He walked back toward his seat, but paused to address his classmates one final time. You spent weeks mocking the ban, thinking it existed to protect humans from situations we could not handle, he said. But the truth is simpler and more frightening. The ban exists because humans handle those situations too well. We do not know how to fight for limited objectives or acceptable losses. When we decide that something is worth protecting, we protect it completely, regardless of the cost or consequences. Jake left the auditorium behind a group of alien students who finally understood that their mockery had been directed at the most dangerous species in the galaxy. The human prohibition protocol was not a punishment or a sign of weakness. It was the galaxy's desperate attempt to prevent humans from turning every conflict into a war for the survival of everything they considered worth saving.